Let's discuss this study that was conducted by Ost in the year 1992. This study was conducted to be able to figure out the role that genes could probably play or the genetic predisposition that some individuals have towards developing this particular mental illness. So, what the researchers did over here was researchers got hold of individuals. There were 81 individuals who were diagnosed with blood phobia. So, 81 of them were diagnosed with blood phobia, and 59 of them were diagnosed with injection phobia. 81 with blood phobia and 59 were diagnosed with injection phobia. And participants in each group were asked whether they had a first degree relative. Now, who's a first degree relative? First degree relative is someone, it could be your parents, it could be your siblings, a first degree relative who had the same phobia. Now, remember, this is an example study. This is an example study that we're studying, that we have to cover as we study this unit, that is anxiety disorders and fear related disorders. And while discussing anxiety disorders, if we talk about the biological, rather say being more specific, the genetic explanation. Now, Ost et al., sorry, not as Ost et al., Ost wanted to figure out in 1992 the relationship your genes could have or the effect your genes could have towards your predisposition or towards the chances you have of developing blood phobia and injection phobia. Now, these participants, they either had blood phobia or they had injection phobia or they had any other specific phobia that could be animal phobia, dental phobia, claustrophobia. If we talk about the procedure over here, the procedure that was used by Austin the year 1992, this procedure comprised of number one, participants having to go through a screening interview. Participants having to complete a self-report questionnaire. And participants having to go through behavioral tests. Now, these behavioral tests, they differed for participants who had blood phobia and the participants who had injection phobia. So these are the three procedures, if I may divide them into three different categories here. So when we talk about these behavioral, these if we talk about screening interviews, these screening interviews, they were conducted by clinicians. They had to go through self-report. They had to fill out a self-report questionnaire that had to do with the history and the nature of the phobia. The history and the nature of the phobia. And the behavioral tests, like I said, these behavioral tests, they differed for patients who had blood phobia and patients who had injection phobias. Injection phobia. Now, if I add on more to this, as I speak about this self-report measure, as a part of the self-report measure, these participants, they had to discuss the impact the phobia had on their normal lives. Impact of phobia. I might as well just put this into a third category. That would make it easier. So they had to give a rating to particular situations, the extent to which particular situations would trigger the fearful response. So when we talk about rating towards particular situations, which might trigger a fearful response. Now, so we're dividing the procedure initially into three phases. Number one, a screening interview. Number two, a self-report question. And number three, a behavioral test. Now, when we talk about these behavioral tests, like I had just mentioned, this behavioral test was different for individuals who had blood phobia and individuals who had injection phobia. So initially, we talk about the behavioral test that was used for individuals who had blood phobia. So these blood phobic patients, they had, or rather say, they were shown a 30-minute silent color video of a surgery. They were instructed not to close their eyes. And watch for as long as they could. At the same time, experimenters were tracking their gaze direction. The experiment was terminated when either the participant looked away, either the participant looked away from the screen, or they stopped the video using a remote. This was the behavioral test that was performed for uh, performed by patients on patients rather who were diagnosed with a blood phobia. However, for the patients who were diagnosed with injection phobia, there was a different behavioral test for them. This test was number one live. We could say performed live. It involved 20 steps from finger from cleaning the fingertip to performing the actual act of pricking, from fingertip cleaning to pricking itself, step by step. Each step was described to the patients. In this case, the participants. Participants were expected to say if they were okay with the next step or not. The test ended if the participants said no. Now, as you see, there are different tests that were performed on participants who were diagnosed with blood phobia as compared to the participants who were diagnosed with injection phobia. Now, this was the data collection method. And if we take this a little further, and if we move on, I hope everyone's done copying. Now, moving on towards outcome measures here. How was the outcome of this particular experiment measured? The outcome was measured number one through, I mean, there was a scoring mechanism that was devised, and through that scoring mechanism, the participants' performance was being graded or rated, and participants was scored on their maximal performance. What does this word maximal performance over here mean? In other words, I think the pencil died. The pencil needs a charge. So yeah, these participants the outcomes of this experiment were measured through different ways. Number one, there was a scoring mechanism that was used, which would be referred to as maximal performance. And over here, for instance, maximal performance in terms of how long was a particular participant able to watch that video. Remember the 30-minute video. Number one. Number two, the experimenters had to rate through an observation what they felt about the participants' fainting behavior. This was again done through a rating scale from 0 to 10, where 0 meant not at all anxious and 10 meant extremely anxious. Number three, the third outcome measure that we had over here was in terms of the participants completing a questionnaire, a self report measure, where they had to write about their thoughts during the test. And the fourth one, that would, of course, help the researchers collect qualitative data. And the fourth way through which the participants, the outcome of this particular experiment was measured through a blood pressure and a heart rate test. So when we speak about a blood pressure and a heart rate test over here, we are talking about physiological measures, with physiological measures that are being measured again through equipments, and equipments tend to be more objective than mere self-report measures. So yeah, the scores on maximal performance. Let me just write it down so that you example for how long the participants watch the video. Number two, the experimenters rating of the participants fainting behavior. And like I had mentioned a minute ago, this was done by using a rating scale that ranged from 0 to 10, where 0 meant, oh, let me just put up an equals, where 0 meant not at all anxious, and 10 meant extremely anxious. The third outcome measure was through a questionnaire. This questionnaire was filled out by participants. The participants filled a questionnaire that had to do with their thoughts during the test. And the fourth measure over here was a physiological measure, actually. Participants' blood pressure and their heart rate was monitored. Now, this first measure, of course, would help the experimenters. This would help the experimenters get quantitative data. So is the case with this second outcome measure. Remember, the pros, the cons that are associated to uh, rating scales to quantitative data should be put to use over here. This was perhaps an example of qualitative data because this has to do with your thoughts. This one has to do with the rating scale. This is scoring. And the fourth measure, physiological measure, this was more objective. That is, there would be no biasness over here because you use equipments. So, another important piece of information over here, while the family histories of participants was being revealed, I'm writing this down because this would help us with a comparison with the findings. The family history of participants revealed that 50% of blood phobics and 27% of injection phobics had one or more parent with the same fear. Additionally, so around 21% of blood phobics also had at least one sibling who shared the disorder. This should be at least. Now, if we move on towards the results over here, if we move on to discuss the results, or rather say conclusions, If you talk about results related to fainting behavior, it was found that there was a very high proportion of participants with blood phobia and injection phobia had a history of fainting. Remember, we have discussed this earlier as well. Amongst other phobias, these type of phobias, they are very popularly known for patients fainting. So when exposed to the respective phobias, around 70% of blood phobics and 56% of phobics, they would the likelihood of them fainting was there. So if we talk in terms of numbers, around 70% of blood phobics and around 56% of injection phobics. We could separate the conclusion from the result that would make it easier for you all. We could write that Ost concluded that there seemed to be a strong genetic link for both of these phobias, or rather say for phobias, which was more likely than other phobias to produce a strong physiological response. And what sort of physiological response are we talking about? We're talking about fainting behavior here.